I remember the first time a poem felt so impactful, it felt like I was meant to read it. I was 16 and sitting in a dark sophomore English classroom. It was the beginning of the year, so most people were still pretty invested in the curriculum. So I remember the room had been fairly quiet. My English teacher had pulled the poem up on the projector, and several people were volunteering to read each of the stanzas. It was a short poem, Invictus by William Ernst Henley. While the word choice and topic of the poem may sound rather intense when interpreted in the context of a 16-year-old girl's life in Florida, it struck a chord with me. The concept of suffering put into such a visceral description, it felt real, it felt raw. When the pain that you're enduring feels that intense, to survive it is a battle. It's an active fight. That was the first time in my life that I felt a poem sink past my rib cage and into my soul. I can't tell you much about what I learned in all of my classes in high school, but I could describe the way that room looked in crystal clear detail. Some moments get stamped like that. That moment stamped its way into my brain because it showed me just how much a poem can resonate, how it can look like a mirror that already knew your reflection before you even met it. I've tried many times since then to get that feeling. I'd loved poetry at that point, but that moment showed me that poetry is one of the great loves of my life. So I continued to read poetry in search of that soul deep mirror feeling. In my search, I've read a lot of great poetry. I've read a lot of okay poetry. I've even read some mediocre and bad poetry. But I really struck gold a couple years ago in Mississippi in a record shop slash bookstore slash cafe. I opened up a poetry collection by Mary Oliver titled New and Selected Poems, Volume 1. I opened up to a random page and found a poem that gave me that same feeling that the classroom did 11 years prior. I begged my friend to get that book for me as my birthday present that year, and I ate through it and found poem after poem after poem that gave me that rare feeling. I had my hands on a buffet of it, a smorgasbord. Once I'd finished the book, I felt this odd urge to put it on my altar. I'd never had that feeling about an item that wasn't traditionally spiritual before. I still feel that feeling. After examining it for a bit, I concluded that poetry for me can be a spiritual practice. When I'm in communication with my soul, it can be guided and enriched by that conversation. A year or so passed, and I knew I wanted to reread the poetry volume and talk about it with all of you. That leads me to today. Today, I'd like to talk with all of you about what I've learned about Mary Oliver and why I think her poetry is applicable to mindfulness in a very UU way. Mary Oliver was born on September 10th, 1935, in Maple Heights, Ohio. She lived there for her childhood. She would eventually work at the Edna St. Vincent Millay, a famous late poet's estate, as the secretary to Norma, Edna's sister. While she worked there for roughly 6 or 7 years, she met the love of her life, Molly Malone Cook. They would go on to happily be together in Provincetown, Massachusetts for over 40 years until the end of Molly's life. Mary eventually moved to Florida and lived there until the end of her life on January 17, 2019, at 83 years old. She published a book in collaboration with her love, Molly, but I was not able to get my hands on it in time to read it before preparing this sermon. From what I can gather of summaries and reviews online, it functioned as an interesting autobiography with Oliver's writing in conjunction with Molly's photography. It was one of many books with Oliver's work in it that I wanted to read. Mary was a private person and said she wanted her work to speak for itself. I do think that certain pieces shine a light on her childhood, such as one titled Rage, which spoke of a cruel person hiding their cruelty that Oliver was still able to spot despite that attempted disguise. It is believed that this was about her father, who was incredibly abusive. She also wrote a poem titled The Journey, which to me felt like a poem that described the complexity of healing from abusive dynamics. It's an understanding that the only person you can heal is yourself. In her words, but little by little, as you left their voices behind, the stars began to burn through the sheets of clouds, and there was a new voice which you slowly recognized as your own, that kept you company as you strode deeper and deeper into the world, determined to do the only thing you could do, determined to save the only life you could save. In total, she published 37 books between 1963 and 2017. That's a book roughly every year and a half or so. I wasn't able to read all of them, obviously, but I did read one of her poetry compilations, the one I mentioned earlier, which covered some of her best poems from the beginning of her career in 1963 up until 1992. I believe I had an edition that had 30 additional poems that were more recent than that. Um, in addition to that, I read some of her poetry that I could find online. In rereading New and Selected Poems Volume 1 and reading some of her work online, I found way more poems that I wanted to talk about than was possible. I simply do not have the time to talk about 20 plus poems. It would fill a lot more than 15 minutes. So instead, I'm going to try zooming in a bit and focus on the other half of the title of this sermon: mindfulness. As a person who has an unfortunate tendency to overthink my overthoughts, it is rare that I find myself able to recognize and internalize simple truths. I have never shaved life's problems with a razor like Occam's and find complexity to feel inherently more truth. Hearing these sentences out loud, it would probably not surprise you to find out that I've previously struggled with mindfulness and meditation, something I've touched on briefly in previous sermons. The intentional act of attempting to think less for me has the effect of making me immediately think more. In my head, it sounds a bit like, okay, I need to focus on my breathing. Okay, now I'm manually breathing. Am I breathing too fast? I feel like I'm breathing too loud. Everyone can hear how loud I'm breathing. What if I'm breathing wrong? I feel like I'm breathing wrong. What's the rate I should be breathing at? Wait, I'm supposed to be clearing my mind. Don't think, don't think, don't think. God, I have so much to do today. Oh, I'm so bad at this. I'm never going to be good at this. And so on, until the timer goes off and I'm left feeling like a runaway train of thoughts, or like I've been trapped in a brain prison. All of that to say, I was initially a bit surprised that Mary Oliver's writing about mindfulness resonated with me as much as it did. I think that has to do with the way that she makes it feel more approachable in her poetry. There is one poem in particular that made it feel less intimidating. It was called I Worried. It goes like this: I worried a lot. Will the garden grow? Will the rivers flow in the right direction? Will the earth turn as it was taught? And if not, how shall I correct it? Was I right? Was I wrong? Will I be forgiven? Can I do better? Will I even be able to sing? Even the sparrows can do it, and I am, well, helpless, hopeless. Is my eyesight fading, or am I just imagining it? Am I going to get rheumatism, lockjaw, dementia? Finally, I saw that worrying had come to nothing and gave it up, and took my old body and went out into the morning and sang. I found it encouraging because I'd read dozens of poems that made me feel like she was an expert in feeling one with nature. To see that she'd had her own fear spirals made it give me a bit of hope. The ending in particular gave me hope. The idea that a part of me would understand what to do once I let myself. The idea of the freedom of something like singing. I think that kind of language, that kind of visualization of mindfulness felt very you to me. Another great example is literally titled Mindful, and it goes like this: every day I see or hear something that more or less kills me with delight, that leaves me like a needle in the haystack of light. It was what I was born for: to look, to listen, to lose myself inside this soft world, to instruct myself over and over in joy and acclamation. Nor am I talking about the exceptional, the fearful, the dreadful, the very extravagant, but of the ordinary, the common, the very drab, the daily presentations. Oh, good scholar, I say to myself, how can you help but grow wise with such teachings as these? The untrimmable light of the world, the ocean's shine, the prayers that are made out of grass. Now, I am no great scholar, but I hope to grow wise with these teachings. Perhaps the call we've heard to mindfulness was not a challenge. Perhaps it was an invitation. When I think of the idea of mindfulness as an invitation, I think of the poem I've heard most often quoted when people are quoting Mary Oliver. I'm sure you've all heard of it. It's called Wild Geese. I actually assume that future Deanna has read it as a part of the words of welcome at the beginning of this service. So I won't read all of it out to you again. But I am going to focus on one line specifically, the one that goes, you only have to let the soft animal of your body love what it loves. Let. We do not teach our hearts to want. We do not teach our eyes to see. Maybe mindfulness and meditation was not an action. Maybe it was a release. After all, what is more at the root of who we are than roots? The sacred web we use speak of to me resembles a mycelium network. We are all firmly rooted in the world we stand on and connected through it. I mentioned earlier that I felt carried to put the, no, not carried, called, to put the Mary Oliver book on my altar. And the more I read and reflected, the more I felt like that was the correct choice. The more I read from Mary Oliver, the more a voice inside of myself reminded me of the roots. The more the voice made me think of that classroom all those years ago. I thought of the mirrors that knew my reflection before I'd gazed upon it. I thought how the soft animal of my body loved the earth and poetry and creation as a spiritual practice. I tried to place what was so special about Oliver's poetry, what made it hit as hard as it did. The best I could put into words now is that reading of her love of the earth feels like remembering. It feels like coming back to myself and recognizing that I am more than myself when my feet are rooted in earth. I am more myself when I remember the majesty of an especially symmetrical looking leaf. I am more myself when it feels like magic every time it starts to rain. There is a softness that returns to my soul when I remember. It feels like a gift to welcome it home. I think Mary Oliver is special to Unitarian Universalists because she understood the special of the everyday. She saw a bird fly by and felt a poem. A soul like that fits in with the UUs. I don't know if you knew of Mary Oliver before today, but I hope you remember her tomorrow and the tomorrows after. I think her life and her work is valuable, and I hope today inspires you to go for a walk soon. I hope it inspires you to look at the animals and the plants and remember the magic of it all. I think Mary would love that for you. I know that I would. Blessed be.